All right, so next I'll be talking about new load models. And I'd like to just put up some questions at the beginning already, which are very critical questions. So the first one is, for how long are results from a load research valid? So if we undertake a load research study today and complete it in a year, for how long can we actually use the results from that load research? And when do we say, hey, we must revise these load models, or there must be continuance in that research? Is there anyone who would like to give any information on this? Well, sometimes I feel like the people who fund such programs also don't have an understanding of that. So there's understanding that if you have performed, ours was done from 1993 to 1999 to, no, it's stretched over up to 2000 and? Or the collecting of the data?
Basically, for the purpose of APMD, you're looking at
7 to 15 years. So any thoughts on this?
If the demographics stay the same, then the data would still be valid. So you migrate your demographics. So someone who was using 100 kilowatts 7 years ago, and another group of people using 100 kilowatts doing a similar type of thing, then the data is valid. Actually, and especially when they did the data collection 20 years ago, those questions were, oh my God, it can't be serious. But that's actually critical to determining that level. Yes, the rand is not worth what it was 20 years ago. It was 5 rand a kilo, to the dollar, and we thought that the rule was going to come down. So, but if you look at the demographics, it might not cost you 20 cents a kilowatt hour, it might cost you 2 rand a kilowatt hour, but I'm still using a kettle and I wake up in the morning. Mm-hmm. So the uses are actually quite critical. So the demographics are actually critical to linking that to your data.
That's one side of the coin.
Yeah, I agree partly, but I also disagree, because we don't use the same, people advanced, and we seem to think that we can design better and make better solutions. The fridge of 20 years back doesn't operate the same as the fridge of today, and the same for a kettle. Kettle is a different story, but we're trying to induction and all of that. Of course, we try and tell ourselves that we are advancing in life, and so that load profile together with everything should be revised to me at least every 5 years.
Climate change. We've seen weather files for Johannesburg from the 1890s. At least one or 2 degrees Celsius change. Not always climate change, but a lot to do with the heat island effect as well. I'm sure that's going to impact on your HVAC loading in commercial buildings.
So there was another study that was done by Marcus and the group. We looked at the load surplus in Germany's framework. And I think one of the findings was that after about 5 years, the surplus changes. And now you can use it. Well, you can use it, but everyone is supposed to use it.
All right, so in academia we say whenever there are research questions, there's research. So the fact that we have different opinions, whether the models are still valid or not, that means that there should be either that actually triggers research to validate whether they're actually still okay or not. So I think that's the question. When do you know, or are there any indicators which point out the need to model, to revise the models? And I think for me, wherever I've presented the stuff about the HB algorithm and all that, people are always asking me, especially engineers in practice, are these models even still valid? It's always a question. So I think it's a burning question. Are LSM models still valid? What factors influence their validity? Are there any indicators which point out the need for modeling? to model. Again, what is the sensitivity of power system applications to load changes? What's significant? Maybe it changed, but is it significant change? Do we see that in terms of the performance of the network? Because there could be changes, or there are changes all the time. And also, remember, these are probabilistic load models, so it caters for some variability anyway. So, what's the sensitivity? Then, any new requirements for modeling? What were the drivers for load modeling in the past? And how does it compare with the present and future? So, for example, if you look at the published models, they are for winter maximum demand, but the requirements have changed. So what are the drivers at present? So an important requirement for the correct analysis for planning, operation, and control of power systems is accurate representation of the steady state and dynamic characteristics of the system loads. And most of the load models used today were developed several decades ago. And models are not adequately updated after the subsequent changes in load structure and load characteristics. And there's renewed interest in both industry and academia for load modeling due to the appearance of new types of loads. Electric vehicles, storage, everyone now is talking storage. And growing interest in models for small-scale embedded generation, whose penetration is expected to increase significantly. So now there is interest now in green models. How do we model PV? How do we model wind and things like that? So the motivation for this is load model parameters require periodic updating. This has been a challenge in so many countries, and I'll show you just now. And that's one motivation is that there are new types of loads and we need to understand them better. And some of the future loads that are not even here at present, but which we anticipate. So we need also to start thinking about those. Then load changes may invalidate load models and parameters established in the past. So hence, there are requirements for change. Then regular update of load models is therefore essential to ensure accurate power system analysis. So there was a research that was done by SAIEE. So they went out internationally to ask utility companies when last they updated load parameters. So when last did you reviewed your load parameters or your load models? And this is what they got. So if you look at, maybe I can draw your attention to Oceania. So you find that 30% of the responses they got were reviews were made between 2 and 5 years ago. But then there were also a lot, 30%, that were saying that revisions were only done 11 to 20 years ago. And some didn't even know. Then you look at Europe. You find that Europe, about 29% of the utility companies had revisions less than a year. So they're continually revising the parameters, revising the load models. And I think what's also interesting probably is if you look at Asia, they have 38% saying that the models were reviewed more than 20 years ago. I think what's missing in this analysis is maybe to now match this with the performance of their networks. Maybe it'll be interesting. But that was not available in this research. But it'll be very interesting. But this is the outlook of frequency of load parameter changes across the world. So I'm coming back locally now, and I've put this roughly, but are there any changes in social demographic factors? Are there any changes? So for example, LSM classification is based on social demographic factors, income, number of dwellers at a premise, things like that. Is the classification still accurate? Are rural customers still that rural? Are they that rural? as we defined rural, because we defined rurality, right? Right? We defined that this is a typical consumption behavior of a rural customer. Is that still valid? So from my engagements with some colleagues, I found out that Eskom is reporting that there's evidence of what they're calling LSM migration. So you find out that that a rural customer is actually like urban something, though they are still confined to the same geographic location, but the consumption in terms of the load has changed. Then appliance ownership as reflected in the LSM classification, is this still valid? And what are the impacts in terms of the load demand? And maybe some say maybe the effects of efficiency and new appliances cancel out. Is that so? We don't know. Then other causes for change in the load, sensitivity to economic growth. So you find that for so long, load focus has been made on the basis of correlation with GDP. And it was accurate to a particular extent. But now it seems that energy is decoupling from economic growth. So if you look at the blue trace, it shows you the GDP, and the orange one shows you the actual load. And you can see the projections of the IRP in terms of the future load. And in most of the cases, you see that it was parallel to the GDP, or correlated to the GDP, but actually the experience is proving otherwise. So, and I've seen that several studies in other countries as well, they're pulling out, this change that the demand is progressively decoupling from economy growth indices. So there has to be new ways in look at load changes and things like that. Then technological advancements. So here we look at the influence of appliance efficiency, for example, changing incandescent with LEDs. So this is simulated data. So you see that there's a reduction in the typical load profile for this customer based on LED. But this was simulated, but in some studies, they're finding out that it's actually also partly true. Then another cause for change is policy instrumentation. For example, phasing out of incandescent, like what happened in South Africa, and the regulation and control of appliance efficiency. So they will say that all refrigerators that are sold must be of level A+ something. So those things can affect the load. And of course, changes in tariff schemes. So you can see on that chart that you can see the different effects. For example, the first one, reduction in consumption. You just see that the whole profile just lowers. Then shifting consumption from peaks. Then this can also be as an effect of tariffing. Then filling in the valleys can be an effect of storage, charging electric vehicles and things like that. Then the last one also shows the reduction in the peak demand. Then new technologies. So as we know that now there is a high penetration in some countries, in South Africa still low, of rooftop PV, solar geysers, wind energy and things like that. Electric vehicles are some of the advancing technology that we are seeing on the networks, and as well battery storage systems. So these new technologies will have significant impact on the load itself. And again, on MV systems, you might find similar technology, but particularly on MV and higher, you might find electric vehicle charging stations. So for example, in the other countries, they have a lot of them across the whole country, and that will change the load demand significantly. The modeling of distributed generation, it changes our perspective to load modeling. So there's an increased penetration levels of renewable energy, as we know. So what happens is that with renewable energy, you have new forms of interdependencies that were not existent before. So for example, if you have wind farms that are in the same area, they're likely to ramp up and down together. So there's high correlation between those farms and things like that. And also there are unknown scenarios. So for example, with PV, we don't know which customer will take up PV and which customer won't, and what capacity they'll put up. So how does it impact our thinking in terms of load modeling? It brings in unknown scenarios, and those require random simulation approaches. So, and also now, because of this penetration of renewable energy, there are now new constraints to planning. So it may no longer be the maximum interval of demand on a winter evening. Now the noon interval is now also a constraint, because if we have a lot of PV, the load is low, then you're going to have voltage rise and things like that. So, and also for EVs, if they charge without tariff control, they might exacerbate the maximum demand, because they might charge when they get home. And the mobility curve is very similar to actually the load curve for residential customers. Then another thing is, what I'm starting to find out, and I'm starting to step into this, is to try to validate the clustering based on socio-demographic factors versus shape clustering, profile clustering by algorithms. And what I'm starting to find out is, even within customers that are classified as LSM, as a single LSM, within those customers, there's significant differences in their consumption. So for example, these are 5 clusters from data from a single LSM, for customers from a single LSM. And you can see that their profiles, but this clustering, you can see that you have, for example, cluster 3, where the noon demand is very high. So probably you have air conditioning there. But then some of them have dips and things like that. So you're starting to find out that LSM consumption, customers in an LSM class are not that homogeneous. And I think with what Marcus you're saying about the correlation factors being as low as 0.4, it can start to speak to my findings here that there's also, heterogeneity to some extent. And I'm starting to think that, for example, for PV penetration, the profile becomes a better way of looking at customer characteristics rather than an interval analysis, where you're looking at demand, in a particular interval. So this is just another perspective to load modeling as well. Then one of the last aspects I'll talk about is the HBA. I'll just talk about a few things. So the Herman-Beta has been extended now to cater for networks at different voltage levels and to include correlation effects. Also, the HBA was limited only to current modeled inputs. So the question was, what if the loads are constant power? What if they're constant impedance? The algorithm must also be able to cater for those. So we've extended the HBA to cater for those things. So I'll skip to here. So now the new approach can handle currents at any power factor, because remember there was an assumption that they behave at unity power factor. So now it can take in current models at power factor, PQ models with a deterministic power factor, then constant impedance models, balanced loads. The reason why I say this, because you might think that the old algorithm still catered for balanced loads, but a balanced load is not balanced unless its currents, its phase currents are correlated as well. The need to move together. Because if they are random, then it can happen that in one phase, the current is 60, in the other is 10, which actually is a high unbalance as well. So there has to be a correlation included in the balanced loads analysis. Then also, we can now do interdependent inputs for DG to DG correlation between loads and between loads and DGs. And the input requirements have already been addressed, and I think Marcus has spoken about defining correlation between customer classes, and things like that. So the conclusion is that load models require periodic revision. New technologies open new opportunities for research in terms of the load research, and distributed energy resources modeling requires as much attention. There's been a lot of attention on the load demand, but I think there has to be also attention on green energy models. Then advancements to probabilistic approaches to power system analysis requires the development of detailed statistical models and the understanding of them. So I once attended a seminar at ESCOM where they were talking about using power factory probabilistic framework. But then if we do not understand the probabilistic load models, what comes out of the use of such an application will be very limited. So I think the advancement has also to go in terms of the understanding of probabilistic load models. Thank you.
Questions?
We were both sitting in a DOE workshop where the presenters were saying to us, this was about advanced energy efficiency and the modeling of it, where they were saying to us that they were modeling the packets of customers in terms of their scope and their scale, I think it was. So they identified classes of customers that they've given certain sort of naming conventions to, and they evaluated the change in energy efficiency by a change in the description of the customers, and therefore another load model, or by the change in the number of customers or the efficiency of those appliances. And it struck me that that's interesting because it's kind of what we're talking about with the planning that we're using. We put load shapes of customers and we put numbers of it typically. But one of the interesting things is that you can get a change in the scope or the scale and your plan changes. Because your subtended load is just going to change. But you're talking about the change in the LSMs. That's very interesting. It's not only the LSMs which are migrating, but the LSMs which are changing to LSM2A or something that we don't have a name for. That's our problem, I think, as well. We don't know what new habits are developing.